What an apt reading, the story of the Good Samaritan. I didn't plan it, I promise you. It's part of the lectionary. And it just so happens that it's all coalesced around this sense of looking beyond ourselves and giving to others, those who are less fortunate, those who might have been battered by the issues of life. And you don't have to look too far to see that happening around us, do we? Joe's explained to us that life circumstances can sometimes mean that people's lives change radically in a very short time. And so we come today. Is there anyone here who hasn't heard the story of the Good Samaritan before? It's okay if you haven't. You know, the story of the man that gets beaten up along the way and then is shown by incredible grace by the person least likely to show that grace. I was wondering how we might put this in a modern day vernacular, how we here today would understand it. And I was thinking somewhat of, one day there was a rally that was against immigration. A party called One Nation was holding it. And there was a man who was member of Amnesty International. He was high profile. He was going to be the next politician that was going, and he decides to go on a journey. But the problem was, as he went on this journey, he was going to a symposium, by the way, on how to treat asylum seekers and migrants, and he had to go and pass through this Pauline Hanson One Nation rally. And so he sets on the way, but as he sets on the way, it was in Springvale, by the way, I didn't tell you that. He's going along, and some of those terrible people just outside of the Uniting Church grabbed him, took him by the lapels, threw him to the ground, took his clothes off and left him there. Meanwhile, walking back from the rally was Pauline Hanson. You know Pauline? Yeah? Sorry? Please explain. Very good. Best answer I've had today, Dee. Please explain. She's walking along and she sees this man. This man was also a man who had come from the Middle East. He was a Muslim. And she sees this man lying by the road, and she goes over to him. She offers him some halal meat, tends his wounds, sets him on his way and says, by the way, I've got a parliamentary car. I'll put you into my parliamentary car and he will drive you to my hotel and you can stay there for a night, free of charge. And whatever you need, I'm going to give you. That's roughly the story that we've heard put into our own vernacular. The person we least think is the one who shows the most grace, especially to that which would seem to be the most foreign, different. And so in my story today, you have heard me make a hero out of Pauline Hanson. Take of it what you will. But it's the least likely experience, isn't it? And that's what Jesus was saying here. The giving of hospitality and mercy by this Samaritan was the last thing that you would have anticipated. But before that starts, there is a question. And it's a young man stands up before Jesus and says, how do I get into heaven? It's an important question, isn't it? Probably one we like to ask in church, but we're afraid to. How can I get to heaven? And he says, well, simple. Love God and love your neighbour. Now, I don't know if this guy was a smarty pants or what, but he stands up and says to Jesus, who is my neighbour? And that, for me, today is the most important question. Who is my neighbour? Who do I show grace, mercy and abundance to? Do you notice in the reading that Jesus doesn't answer the question for him? He says, well, after the end of the story, who do you think the neighbour is? And I think today we are here with the same question. Who is our neighbour that we need to show compassion and mercy to? And it's very easy for a minister to stand up, especially one of a more liberal theological persuasion, Because I would say to you, the asylum seekers or the newcomers to this country, those who are most marginalised. But it really doesn't matter who I think neighbour is. It matters who you think your neighbour is. Who do you think is the neighbour that we need to show compassion, mercy and love to? We may come up with some different answers. You know, the one thing that never surprises me is when you do ask a question, that you do get different answers from people. I often ask the kids a question, don't I, when they come out for Sunday school, and I'm often intrigued, I think is the word, at some of the answers I get. And you might come up with different answers. But we've got to ask the question. And it's not just a question of being theologically or politically right about this. It's actually asking the question, who actually needs this care, this love, and this acceptance? In the middle of a gospel, the Gospel of Luke, that talks about the incredible and radical grace that God gives to each one of us, we in turn have to look in the mirror and say, who do we give that grace back to? Who becomes the recipient of God's grace through me? You see, it's easy to get lost in the nice parable of the Good Samaritan. But the reality is we don't live in nice parables. We live in a world that is hurting, often struggles to find meaning, and people around us who really want to make something of their life, but circumstances don't help that. So, you know, like this young man who wants to ask, I guess, the theological question, you know, how do I get into heaven? Well, I know the answers, because to be a scholar in those days meant to understand the Jewish law. And the Jewish law was found in the Torah, which he is quoting at the moment, to love God and to love your neighbour as yourself. That's not Jesus' ideas. That's ideas that go right back to the foundation of Israel itself, and dare I say, probably back way beyond that. The sense of hospitality and courtesy is one that affects every generation. Certainly it goes back to Abraham before the Torah was written, and a time of how do we give grace to those who need grace? How do we show mercy and justice to those who need mercy and justice? So the question for us today is, who is our neighbour? Are you brave enough to ask that question? Joe's challenged us a bit today, hasn't he? In talking about the people who we find battered along the roadside, along our roadside. Interestingly, in the story of the Good Samaritan, what happened when the crooks and the villains got hold of him? Do you remember? Well, you've listened to the story about 10 minutes ago. You know, maybe we need to put it up. No, we don't. No, we don't. Sorry, Dee. They stripped him, didn't it? You know what? Without his clothes and his finery, you couldn't tell what nationality he was, because in the Middle East, they mostly looked like each other. So whether he would have been a Jew or Samaritan to the person that walked past, you couldn't tell what class he was from, whether he was rich, whether he was poor, because he had no clothes on to indicate the wealth that he had. In fact, that person had become a non-person in the eyes of the passerby. The ones that passed him by, were they bad people? No. The religious people that passed him by knew if he was dead and they touched his body, they would be ceremonial unclean and they wouldn't be able to perform their religious duties. But you see, it's not about religious duties. It's not about being politically correct. It's actually about showing mercy and compassion to those who need mercy and compassion. In the Gospels, Jesus never passes by a need of a person. Gender doesn't come into it. Nationality doesn't come into it. In fact, often the ones that show the greatest grace in all of it are the least, the Gentile, the Syrophoenician woman, the ones that actually understand the ministry of Jesus. Because so often our religious biases and our understanding stop us from having clear eyesight to show mercy to those who need mercy. In this society, it shouldn't be whether you are a Muslim, a non-believer or a Christian, or what faith you are or what skin colour you are, that should work out whether you are worthy in this place. It should be because we are all creations of a loving God. That's how I believe it. And all people are worthy, whether we think so individually or not. So today, as we come to a truncated and a rather short sermon, the question for you today is, who is your neighbour? And like Jesus, I will leave you to answer the question. May God bless us richly. Thank you. Narat, would you bring our reading?